So, Lone Rider here, and I just got back from my first actual off-road ride on any SuperV, but in particular on this one, the SuperV 2000 that I have been working on fixing up. And let me tell you, it was awesome. I don't really know how to explain it except that this bike rides very well, despite its age, and that that's a credit to the designer. Also, I was using it what it was designed for. I wasn't treating it like a downhill bike or anything like that. I was riding cross-country type trails on it, regular mountain bike trails. In particular, I went to Lewis Morris, which is a park in Morris County, New Jersey, that has hiking, biking, trails, that sort of thing. There's a variety of terrain. There's single track, there's double track, there's a handful of dirt roads. So, you have your choice. It's also this parts which are, somewhat level, but most of it's very hilly. However, there's, different types of trails there. You could find something whether you're, really hardcore or whether you're just out there for a recreational ride. And same thing with the hiking. There's some of the trails that are really steep and some are, more moderate. So it's a place where you can find something for everyone, and I often go there on bikes because you can't really mountain bike in Union County, and I can usually get away with riding the dirt roads along the power lines because that's on the other side of the river, and technically it's another county, so nobody's going to hassle me for that. But the problem is a lot of times they're really muddy, and they're in some cases underwater from water that overflowed the banks of the adjacent river. So if I want to ride off-road, I have to drive to Morris or Somerset County, in this case Morris County. But the bike handled everything with aplomb. There were a handful of sections of the trail where, going over it, there's like in the old days, I think we called it a water bar, but I don't know if it was actually put there as like a wooden beam or if it was a tree root, but there was a series of sections where there was something wooden going across the trail, and then the trail would drop down like half a foot or a foot or whatever, and then continue and drop down again. I believe some of them may have been naturally occurring tree roots, some of them may have been put there to route water off the trail, but either way, you're going over the trail and then all of a sudden, and it's a small thing, but the point is that I wasn't sure the front shock was good to go, and I was afraid that if I went over anything like that, or over a small log or large rocks or something, that the bike would come down and the front fork would just compress and not rebound, and I would go woo over the handlebars, and nothing like that happened. In fact, the front fork, the rear suspension, the overall handling of the bike, everything was awesome. It was as good as I could have expected, and possibly better. There were sections where it was technical. There was some roots and ruts, and it was narrow and overgrown. The bike handled it fine. There were some fairly steep sections, both going up and going down. The bike handled it fine. Really, this, for a bike that's over 20 years old, this thing acquitted itself awesomely. And honestly, there's only like two things I can think of about it that I found problematic. But keep in mind, this is the first time I've ever ridden it off-road. These may be idiosyncrasies related to how this particular bike handles, either the geometry, the suspension, the sizing, etc. Keep in mind with sizing, when you're talking a vintage bike, you don't have all the choices you do when you go into a bike shop and say, hey, I want to order one new. So the first thing I had a slight issue with, and again, this didn't affect the quality of my ride, but there were a couple moments when it was made me a little nervous. The seat height and reach to the ground with my feet. Because this is a dual suspension bike, I actually have to set my seat height higher than normal if I wish to get proper leg extension to the pedals, in order to account for the sag, that is the amount of droop in the suspension when you're actually sitting on the bike, but before the suspension is activated by going over bumps. It's not much, it's a fraction of an inch, but that can make all the difference if you're trying to touch the ground on uneven ground, and that's the thing. This type of, you have to reach a little bit further, is not an issue on the road. It's not an issue on, a flat surface. It's an issue on an uneven surface, the kind of thing you frankly find in the woods on a dirt trail, right? Sometimes, there's, level, flat, double track, but then there's also, uneven trails with uneven surfaces. And so you go to put a foot down and all of a sudden, you have to reach further and there's no ground there because there's a dip in the ground. You're either getting, tipping off your bike or you're having a problem. Now this is true for all dual suspension bikes, more or less. But in this particular case, it did feel that I had to sit higher than, let's say, for example, on my Kona Dog. Now the Kona Dog is about 10 years newer than this. So it's a different design of suspension, so I don't know. But, so that was it. It was the seat height, in order to get proper leg extension with the suspension, was a little tall. Not a little tall for pedaling. It's perfect for pedaling, that's the whole point. It was a little tall for reaching the ground, which meant that in certain sketchy sections I was like, I'm a little nervous. There was one narrow wood bridge over a creek I didn't feel comfortable riding over because I was looking at it and I was like, I know if I have to put a foot down or whatever, I'm falling in the creek because I can't, I can't reach the ground even with my tippy toes. So that was that. The only other thing was, tire width. I have fairly standard tires on these. And they're not really big, they're not really narrow, they're just kind of average. And there were a couple sections where somebody had put gravel down, probably because the trail was, they didn't want that part of the trail to, get maybe eroded or something. Maybe they were worried about, water running across it. But it was really fine gravel, and I found my tire sinking into it. And at least one time I had to actually stop and then get started again because my tire was bogged down in it the way you get a tire bogged down in sand. Now the only thing that would really conceivably prevent this, aside from just realizing that there's going to be gravel there and finding a better a better line to go down that section of trail, would be wider tires. And I could fit wider tires on this, certainly. I just, these are like 1.9s or something. I could probably fit, 2 1/4 easy, but I just don't have the money to get new tires right now. So, if I end up riding this a lot more, I could take them off another bike. But aside from that, So two things, those tires that it has on it are, they're fine for general riding, but if you're going over, muddy or sandy or gravelly ground, they're a little narrow. And the seat height had to be set a little high to accommodate the suspension sag, and that left me feeling a couple times like I was gonna not be able to reach the ground and tip over. But all in all, this, considering it's a 20-year-old bike that was in pretty rough shape when I got it, this thing rides, it's wicked cool. And I didn't have a problem stopping if I had to stop. There was once where somebody was coming with a dog, and just out of courtesy, I pulled over and stopped on the side. And then, of course, when the dog came by, I settled over the dog because I love dogs. It was very friendly. It was a sweet golden retriever. And then there was another fellow coming the other way on a mountain bike, and I just pulled over the side to let him by because, why not, out of courtesy. I wasn't going, it's not like I had anywhere to be. I wasn't, in a rush. It was kind of funny that not only was I able to pull over, stop, and then put a foot down off to the edge of the trail, the guy riding by must have noticed it was like an old school bike. He said something like, "Oh, cool vintage SuperV, or old school SuperV or something like that." And it is kind of funny. This is one of the iconic bikes of that era. So anybody who rode back then or had a pulse back then and is now into mountain biking is going to probably recognize it. Just not only for its place in cycling, but its place in pop culture. A handful of the top cyclists at the time, including Missy Geove, from the mountain bike world, appeared on shows like Letterman, where they actually rode the bike down the stairs in the studio and, jumped up on top of the host's desk. So these bikes were, well known then. They're still well known now, and I think there's a reason for that. Beyond the high profile and the fact that Cannondale was obviously trying to create press for its new line of bikes at the time. I think the reason that there's a lot of things that people try to create press for, and they're seen as a gimmick, but nobody remembers them 10 years later, let alone 20 years later. These 20 years later have a following, as seen from the fact that I already have a dual suspension bike, a very nice one, a very functional one, a much newer one than this, and yet I decided to go out of my way to get my hands on this when the opportunity presented itself. And here's the funny part. This bike, it doesn't really ride like you would expect a full suspension bike. It kind of rides like a hardtail that just has a little bit of the edge taken off. Don't get me wrong, going over certain things you notice the suspension, but generally speaking, the way I ride this bike, I was riding it as if it was a hardtail and just allowing the suspension to do its thing. And in my opinion, suspension is kind of like editing in a good film. If the suspension does its job, you don't even notice it's there, right? Film editing, if you have a lot of cuts during action sequences or whatever, people notice it. They say, oh, that's, you're doing a bad job there. When they don't even notice the editing is when it's working properly and nobody complains. It's kind of the same thing with the suspension. If the suspension is doing its job, ideally, you won't even think about it. You won't even realize it's there. And it is kind of funny. I've spent quite some time actually trying to ride more of my rigid bikes, like my Univega, my rigid Cannondale. And I do honestly think there's something to be said for that as well. But this was just really fun to take out, and I really do enjoy it. And I think if you have to have a dual suspension bike, looking up one of these may not be a bad way to go. They still have a following 20 years later. People still recognize them in passing. They handle everything that your typical set of trails will throw at it. They're comfortable to ride. They perform well, and they're just wicked cool, right? It's also very light. One of the things I noticed is this bike, between the bar ends and the fairly lightweight, especially for a dual suspension bike. This did not have a problem going up things. And after a while, it's been a while since I went, actually mountain biking rather than just riding on a dirt road or whatever. And I noticed, I'm not as slim as I used to be. I noticed there were a couple times I was going up some hills and I was like, oh man, I wish this hill wasn't quite so steep. But when I went out on this thing, today, I realized this thing climbs pretty good, right? It does, especially for a full suspension bike. You're not lugging a lot of weight up that hill, and it feels like a hardtail while you're doing it. So, bravo to the Cannondale engineers. 20 years later, they did a wicked cool job on this bike, which it's actually kind of funny. I tried to look up when this was made. According to the date code on the bottom of the bottom bracket where they have the serial number marked, it's from 96, late night, like December 96 or something. But the problem is when you look up the one from 96 on the website, it's only shown in like polished silver, natural polished aluminum. This is the SuperV 2000 after all, with the fatty 70 head shock, and there's a rock shocks under here. So it's been hard for me to find out as far as the year goes. The components are replacements. These all pretty much came with Coda cranks and whatnot, especially the early ones. This is a later model, Shimano XT and Shimano cranks. So I don't know as far as that goes. They replaced some parts. Tracking down the year has been difficult, and I think that it's going to remain so. I honestly don't know. Cannondale SuperV. was made for many years and many varieties, and trying to figure it out is difficult. You can't just look at the Cannondale's catalog, and you can't just look at the serial number range. The serial number range for this tells me this is a frame from 1996, December 1996. But the catalog from 1996 doesn't show this model with this paint job and setup, let alone with silver bearing cups and stem and all sorts of things. And since it's a proprietary stem and a proprietary headset, maybe they offer them both in black and silver, but I don't know. I mean, it's just strange. And then you look at the catalog from 96, and they show this model, but only in silver, only in polished aluminum. So was the frame made one year and then it didn't get around to being sold until the next model year when they looked at it and they were like, this year's got a different paint job, so they just painted up. And that explains the discrepancy. I honestly don't know. These were high-end bikes at the time. These were, like I said, these were the bikes that the top racers were riding. So honestly, maybe they weren't selling a lot. You know, the higher-end bikes don't move the same volume as entry-level or mid-level bikes for a reason, right? It's like there's a lot less people buying Rolexes than there are buying, like a Citizen or Timex or something. So maybe the frame was made one year and wasn't sold until the next year, which is why it was, painted differently. I honestly am not sure. But whatever year this is, it is definitely from sometime in the 1990s. It kicks ass. It rides really good under a variety of conditions. Like I said, some caveats there, including the seat height to accommodate the sag. But then again, I've never taken this off-road before, so maybe I just got to get used to it. So I had a grand old time. This thing is awesome. I can't wait to take it back to the woods and lone rider out. Yeah, if you get a chance to get a hand on one of these, definitely give it a try. I'm so glad I did. I'm riding like it's 1996 all over again, and honestly, that puts a smile on my face. Lone rider out.